Welcome back, guys. It's your guy, Gunblade Guy, Nate. I want to talk about a discourse I've been hearing online lately of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth being just another Horizon clone. And with it, this discussion of not every game needs to be an open world game, guys. Don't do it. Stop making them all open world. No. This is an argument that's been going on for like a decade now, but it just keeps coming back because we see games get expanded in their scope and then there's backlash. I want to talk about that. And it comes from this place of the devs for Rebirth saying that they were inspired by the game Horizon. Forbidden West, Zero Dawn, is that it? I don't know. I'm not a huge Horizon player. My wife plays them, but the devs saying that they like those games and they're inspired by them, like, ignited this firestorm online of Rebirth is just Horizon. It's just a clone. It's ripping it off, and it's just pulling on all those same boring, tired tropes of the open world genre that we've all come to expect and we've all grown familiar with. So first of all, what is Horizon? Horizon is an open world game defined by the fact that you explore a vast, largely unrestricted environment in an effort to accomplish a myriad of goals in an order that you see fit. So you gather resources to craft items and weapons, you level up your character and expand a skill tree, you accomplish tasks that change the status quo of a surrounding area or give you new allies or capabilities. You occasionally engage in set-piece missions that advance the overarching plot. That's broadly what a open world game entails, and we've got a lot of them. You can say, is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth this? Yes. And did it rip off Horizon necessarily? No, because I think that this design trend is a natural evolutionary gathering of design choices that have been developing kind of as a slow burn in the industry long before Horizon hit the scene in 2017. Tomb Raider 2012 had a lot of these ideas of crafting and gathering environmental items to expand a skill tree. Before that, there was the Assassin's Creed series that had you in, whether you're in towns or more open areas, you were just running around tackling tasks in your order as you see fit. And I mean, Grand Theft Auto came out back in 2013, I think. And that is an open world game too. So you can have open world games that have very different flavors and styles to them. So to say that Horizon is the pinnacle or the be all end all of this trend is kind of dumb to me to say that point, just because the Rebirth devs talked about that specific game as an inspiration. It's like, well, there's a lot more history to it than that. So I think we need to talk about meme judgments of gamers, players, reviewers, even people dedicating reviews to ideas of a single idea that is expressed in the media becoming a basis for a whole judgment call. I call these meme judgments. And so when you think about it, the devs saying they were inspired by Horizon doesn't mean that you're getting exactly Horizon in every respect. And so I remember a lot of reviews in this last year and criticism and ideas that Final Fantasy XVI, the recent one to come out just before this one, that game was a Game of Thrones ripoff. And that comes from a very real place of the devs saying they sat down and were inspired by the tone of Game of Thrones when they made their game. Now, does tone equal a game's content or story? No, it doesn't. Now, the intro to Final Fantasy XVI definitely has some of those elements with these political talks going on and a very conniving betrayal, status quo change that happens in the main character's life in the opening demo, so not too many spoilers. But to just throw it out there, Final Fantasy XVI's overarching plot is about as Final Fantasy you can get, and not Game of Thrones at all. For, general spoilers here, but I mean, you got to be living under a rock at this point if you don't know the plot of Game of Thrones. But a lot of the status quo changes and developments that happen in that show or in the books are of a very political, conniving nature, where people making alliances, cutting deals, doing backstabbing betrayals in the dark of night, or wooing someone into what they envision as safety and they get killed or something. That's Game of Thrones. And really, this is going to be kind of a spoiler for 16 here. If you haven't played it, maybe skip ahead. But I'll say this, Final Fantasy 16 is, after those first couple hours, you go on a quest to destroy the crystals. And in past Final Fantasy games, you either do that or you gather crystals. It's a very Final Fantasy 1 through 5 storyline, if we're being honest. You don't topple nations via political agreements, backstabbing, shadowy deals, or the back and forth of negotiations or alliances or anything like that. You topple nations in 16 by going to their country, killing their leader or their dominant, and destroying their crystal. And their whole country evaporates after that, or whatever, in order for you to forge these new things in the shadow of that. And that's one, not very Game of Thrones at all, and two, very Final Fantasy in the tradition of the series. If we're going back to its deepest origins, that's just straight up a Final Fantasy experience. So it's like, to base entire reviews and criticisms and people's meme judgments of it, like they ripped off Game of Thrones, it's like, you obviously haven't played the game, and you don't really know the history of either series if you come to that analysis. And so it's really interesting to see that made its way into people's reviews, even just because it had a certain tone established in the outset. Similarly, there's memes that have been persisted for decades of like Final Fantasy 12 is a Star Wars ripoff because Balthier and Fran are kind of like Han and Chewie in a weird way. They got a ship. She's a beast girl. He's a beastly guy, I guess. And then they started making these comparisons like, well, Ash is Leia and Bosch is Obi-Wan. And it's just like, oh, wait, no, you're losing me. So it's like, who's Pinello? And Vaughn, the character that you can literally pluck out of the story, is analogous to the guy who is the most important person in the galaxy and embodies all of the qualities of an extinct order to save the galaxy from a tyrant. And then Vayne is Vader in the fact that, remember when Darth Vader's little brother joined the Resistance in order to undermine him? And they're all on a quest for Nethicite, Magicite, etc. None of that is Star Wars. You find one little thing that has a little bit of an inspiration or a hint of a crossover, and it becomes people's entire argument or identity when criticizing something. And it's like, no. I remember the statement, it's all there. It's so blatantly a ripoff. And it's like, are you stupid? And so, let's not use meme judgments. Let's not use one piece of information in an interview to make a whole judgment call about something. And it's just in all of these examples, you pick one little piece of information, you paint with broad strokes and a crusty brush that the person was too lazy to clean. And as a painter, I know you don't do that, right? So I also want to say that the game Horizon existing doesn't mean that we can't ever have anything kind of like it in the future. If that were the case, we wouldn't have Elden Ring because Breath of the Wild exists, right? Elden Ring was very inspired by Breath of the Wild. That was an open statement made by the devs. And so I think that we have a space for more games that are kind of inspired by each other and want to be like each other to exist, yet do their own thing. Elden Ring definitely does its own thing, and I think Rebirth does its own thing too. And I heard this sentiment has been around for ages too. I remember back in the PS3 era, we had the Lords of Shadow series. Castlevania was kind of layered on top of an existing IP that really didn't get off the ground, and so they added in some Castlevania touches to add some value to it. And you know what? I loved it. It was written off at the time as a God of War clone, because in those recent years, we had just gotten God of War 1 and 2 PSP spinoffs. I'm not sure if 3 was out yet. I'd have to look that up. But it's a God of War clone because you have whippy blades. And it's like, hey, bro, Castlevania invented the whippy weapon, my guy. Like Nintendo, the dude with the whip that turns into a chain whip over the standard whip. Like, I'm sorry. That's just the way it goes. You get a big flaily whippy weapon when you play a Castlevania game. I'm sorry. I think that game more than justified its own difference. And it was very different in tone, story, execution than God of War in a lot of ways too, to the point where it's like I love it in its own unique way. So a lot of those meme arguments just don't hold water with me again. So let's talk about Rebirth. We'll get back into it. Rebirth is an open world. Final Fantasy VII OG has a world map. Rebirth's world is that world map, but it's open. And so your open world of Rebirth is at the same scale and design execution as your set piece towns and dungeons and things like that, in that they're largely indistinguishable from one another, though you do know when you're in an open world segment of Rebirth because the map kind of tells you that. So it's bigger, filled with details and activities and lots of stuff that wasn't in 7 OG, right? Well, it's also got a lot of things that were, like catching chocobos, using them to climb new areas off the grassy flatlands, playing a tower defense minigame, fighting rare monsters to get enemy skills, etc. There's a ton of extra stuff in Rebirth, but there's also a lot of stuff that's inspired by that world map experience to some degree. And, you know, Final Fantasy games had this thing back in the past that they've kind of gradually been doing away with, whereas the standard game would kind of just play out with not a ton of side content up until the very end. And then right before the last boss, they just shovel side content onto you. And I think the games have been moving more towards a system where the side content is gradually doled out over the course of the whole game and not necessarily right at the end with all of the extra, like, wrap up your loose ends content. And so we're seeing that here. Like, if you got a mountain climbing chocobo at the end of Final Fantasy VII OG, well, here we're getting it, you know, roughly 10 hours into the second game in the series, we have a mountain climbing chocobo. It is what it is. You can go to places that are high up, and that's cool, right? So I think there's a lot of that thing of, instead of shoveling a ton of bonus stuff on you at the end, because back in the 90s, they feared that people would, like, get too unfocused with the game. And I think because of the trend of the open world becoming more common, they're comfortable doing that, right? And that's, in my opinion, better and cool, because once I'm done with that content, I'm craving my next set piece. With the length and bombacity of some of these, they can kind of get exhausting. So I like the change of pace to just do battles nonstop. But I want to give you another revelation here. You can play the game the exact same way you played original Final Fantasy. Crazy, I know, right? So let's talk about the OG loop and world. My first time through as a kid, I wasn't fully versed in RPGs. I'd played a couple. I played more so like action RPGs like Illusion of Gaia and things like that. But I hadn't made my way through a whole ass Final Fantasy game at that point. So the idea of grinding wasn't really inherent to my gameplay style. The way I played OG, I would run from location to location, and then I would beat whatever content was in each town or dungeon or whatever by the skin of my teeth. I'd run out of MP halfway through the sequence. I got stuck on a boss's like Gin attack in the Cosmo Canyon caves because I didn't know you could just throw a potion at him to kill him. He was kicking my ass because I was underpowered. I was underleveled because I didn't really know. I just ran. I went towards the next thing to do immediately. And on subsequent playthroughs, I learned about the grind. And in between my bouts of town visiting and progressing the stories, I would run around in a circle and hold circle. Now, is that terribly interesting gameplay that we're missing now to anyone? The grind of doing this and holding the circle button. But in doing so, my levels, HP, damage, materia, all went up. Number go up. That feels great, right? But this was not a test of it or an expression of any kind of skill. It was patience and endurance to sit through this experience to get the numbers up to where they needed to be. I'd go to school and brag to my other 7 players in my group of people that I'd recruited that how amazing this game was. I'd brag to them that my characters were all at 6,500 HP before the Temple of the Ancients, and Eris had learned all of her limit breaks. I don't know. Why is that so important that Eris learned all of her limit breaks before the Temple of the Ancients? Who knows, right? But so I'd brag about that. And that was the content in between the towns, was to spend those extra hours circling around like this. So Can you play either of those play styles in Rebirth? The answer is yes, because they have something called dynamic difficulty. The game scales to your level. So that means if you engage almost none of the open world content and just run to the next story objective town like you did in OG Final Fantasy, you're not going to be too weak or undergeared or whatever, because gear is in the shops and a lot of those power spikes just come from playing the game and things are your level. Now, you might have a lighter kit, your folios, whatever that means to you. Progress might be lower, but you do get some of that just naturally and passively, but you also get more from doing the side stuff, right? So, I mean, that's analogous to my experience where I was struggling with some of the elements of the game my first time through because I didn't do any grinding. Well, that's the experience right there for you. And so you might be thinking, but Nate, you miss out on all those side character moments and story elements that happen in the open world between the characters bonding and things like that. And it's like, well, OG didn't have any of that in the open world either. In fact, OG's character bonding basically happened over the course of the entire game, whereas we have more character bonding in Rebirth for sure. But a lot of those bonds were made really strong in Remake. Like it was before you went topside in Remake Part 1 that Barrett had basically accepted Cloud as a stalwart ally and like who he was as a person, learned to accept him. And that did not happen that soon in the game. So think about that. I mean, with this dynamic difficulty, you can just run to the next town the same way you did in OG, and you still have a game to play right there for you. You still have content to do. You do not need to do the side content. Just because it's there doesn't mean you need to do it. Now, if you were like me and you've learned to run around in the circle, and hold circle, well, I guess the game is a little bit different because the world content, you now have actual content. For me, grinding is what I call non-tent. Games that are too grindy or just don't have devices by which to satisfyingly increase my level by like actually playing a video game of sorts. I feel like that's arbitrary padding. And it's so funny that we talk about Remake and Rebirth having padding, but if you want to be really strong in 7 OG, you do the padding of the grind, right? And I think that was something really interesting. Other MMOs tried to do it, but World of Warcraft was one of the first big MMOs that just made quests the means by which you level. Grinding was greatly reduced in that game over its contemporaries that were out at the time. I remember in Final Fantasy XI just sitting in groups pulling things in Valkyrie Dunes just because that was the best way to get XP. Like that was all you did, was just pull and kill, pull and kill. And it was sometimes a fun social activity, but in a lot of ways it was like that running in a circle, holding circle, because there wasn't a ton of communication. There wasn't a ton of like brain work going on there. And there wasn't a means to have a ton of brain work going on there because you didn't have a ton of things to do. You just pressed your one button when it was up and let auto attacks happen, right? So again, this is a play style. The grind is something that's been phased out of gaming. And now we have stuff to do in Rebirth's world, in the same world that was in OG. And I'll say this, when you look at the world map, it's basically, in a lot of respects, the same world map. Let's talk about the Junin area. They have, spoilers, I guess, but like they have the Fort Condor is gone, and it's boiled down into this mini game. And there's a story reason for that. But they still have like a side pocket resistance area where you meet some people scrapping it out to live free of the Shinra life, right? And that was the Fort Condor ethos, the theme that was introduced, that there were people scrapping it out against Shinra out in the wilds there. That was what Fort Condor brought to the story. So in a lot of respects, the world is still the same world. It's just kind of like that HD version of what we had. And now there's things to do in it as opposed to just grinding, right? And I think for me, personally, the thing I like the most in the world, aside from all the other things, and the mini games are fun, I liked the Fort Condor game. I liked it more in the Yuffie expansion than I do in Rebirth's version. So that's a little sad that it's a downgrade. But I really like Queen's Blood. I want a Queen's Blood mobile app, if I'm being honest. But, the thing that I like the most is the hunts. Then they have taught me how to be a better Remake series player, way more than anything did in the first installment. So Remake, it would have special conditions to beating enemies. Some of them were immune to physical damage. Some of them would get staggered by this or that. But it largely boiled down to just finding what their weakness was and dishing that out. And I think here, the special conditions tacked onto hunts have really taught me to emphasize patience and kind of keeping an eye out for special moves and some of the desperation moves that opponents deal out. In Remake Part 1, I kind of had this opinion that, like, things were just inevitable. You were just going to get hit by some strong attacks. Maybe you dodge them, but running triage was the most important factor. Having ATBs ready to deal with triage was a huge part of that game, in my opinion. Maybe I'm playing it wrong, but in playing Rebirth, I was taught so many more things about how to deal with situations and just not take damage or interrupt enemies at the right moment or use specific skills that I have in new and interesting ways via the hunts and the special conditions they put out there. It taught me to be a lot more thoughtful of how I was approaching situations and what to look out for and what to stack and kind of save in my kit. And so that was huge to me, doing these hunts and finding them really challenging and interesting, especially on the dynamic difficulty where there's no real ability to overlevel them. You just have to do them right, you know? So if you're pulling up to a hunt in normal difficulty and you're 5 levels over it because it's one of the last things you did or you're on that side of the map, they can be pretty easy or you can just overpower your way through it. Whereas in dynamic difficulty, you're just going to have to probably do the mechanics right if you want to walk away with it with all 3 check marks. And that's super cool. And I think back to when I played the demo for Rebirth, I sucked at the hunts because I was still playing them in my Remake mindset of, like, go hard, go fast, drop your shit, have a character sitting with 2 ATB stocked for heals, and just go for it. And the mechanics of the games were just taught to me so much better in Rebirth via these open world elements and the hunts that you can do and the special boss fights that you find in the open world as well. And I think it's a little bit of a mistake that, like, they think that the main quest can't ask that of players, that they have to hide that kind of, like, a little bit more engaging battle content in the open world stuff because it's ultimately skippable if you find you can't do it, but the main quest isn't skippable. I think you can challenge people in the main quest a little bit more, but that's just my opinion. And I think largely in games, there can be bland and boring open areas or open worlds, and Final Fantasy XVI is a great way to illustrate that. The game was amazing at points, mainly the primary quest, but I don't think it ever really justified its open areas to me, and they could have been much more condensed and pared down to just what you needed out of them instead of being these sprawling areas. Because while they gave some good hunts and fights, none of the region themselves, like, gave me lore or vibes or, like, were telling me a story or driving me into engage in them in any deeper level. And they weren't particularly interesting to look at. They were just generic woodland areas, desert area, you know? And you spend half the game with the game in, like, a purple shit filter. So that's absolutely stupid. And I don't know who made that decision for them. But they could have made it just like midnight and it'd be a lot more attractive. And just have much better mood lighting, but whatever, that's their choice. But none of the regions were particularly interesting and, like, didn't really make me want to explore them besides having the obligation to go to area X, Y, or Z to finish something. Whereas Rebirth areas do justify taking a look at some of these spaces. Like, I think about walking around an environment, seeing Gold Saucer in the horizon, or the grasslands having all of the little chocobo farms and seeing Calm off in the distance, the Junin area with all of the shipwrecks and things to traverse over. I was taking so many photo mode pics because they just look so good and the game is gorgeous and you see everything interesting about the area around you. Whereas, like, again, in 16, there's a lot of spaces where the topography of where you are is just blocking your sight lines of what's next. You're either in the woods or you're walking through, like, a craggy mountain. So you're just looking at rocks and trees. Whereas 7 lets you elevate and lets you have these scenic vistas and look at amazing sights and scenes. It's bright, it's goofy, it's cozy, it's fun, and yeah, I love it, and I think it justifies turning the world map into the game itself, not coordinating me off into this like separate little high school science experiment version of what a world map is. I like that. Now, the last thing I will say is Chadley does suck. I hate Chadley, and it's a baffling decision to me to have this guy be the thing that drives the open world. This is the game's biggest mistake, in my opinion, is we have Avalanche Splinter Cells, we have Junin Shinra resistances, etc., throughout the world. We have the Cosmo Canyon resistance people, etc. So why do I have to be making the elites more elite? Why do I have to make the rich richer to get what I want out of this experience? Because, Chadley's secretly fighting against Shinra, but we don't know that. Like, he could potentially be feeding intel right into one of Seven's most horrifying characters. If we're being honest, Hojo is one of the most disgusting characters in the series, and for good reason. I'm not saying like Hojo doesn't deserve to be in the game. He's purposely that guy, but I don't want to help him. I don't want to like be tertiarily his ally, like be making a devil's bargain with Hojo. Have pockets of anti-Shinra scrappers, fighters that could be using my resources, my intel, my lore, my mastery over the wilds to enhance their own capabilities. They're now better at surviving against monsters because of what I've learned. They now have food and weapons and things they need to make it out there, outside of the Mako ecosystem. They don't need Shinra's. They're off the grid, right? Because of what I'm doing for them. That would be huge. I love everything about doing the activities except for the conceit of why I'm doing them, because the Chadley explanation is just dumb as balls. And I literally could not hate that aspect of the game more. I tune it out of my brain and I headcanon that it's something else, if I'm being honest. I don't know what else to say about that other than like Japan needs its little cute kawaii character doing this. Yay, woo, ha ha ha, you're so great. And it needs to be a 12-year-old child with like a sailor outfit or something. I don't need that here, right? Maybe there's kids playing the game, but that like identify with that or something. I don't know. It breaks the entire narrative of why Cloud would be out there doing these kinds of things, other than like, yeah, I guess I need that materia, bro. It's like, well, that's Yuffie's thing. Yuffie might be cutting that deal with Chadley of like, yeah, I'll research stuff for you for materia. I'll do anything for materia, but Cloud is not that stupid. Like, I don't get it, right? Other than, yeah, you get power. You get your abilities enhanced. Chadley sucks. Hold triangle to tune him out completely. So, whatever. But does that answer your question? Did Rebirth need to be open world? Is Rebirth just like Horizon? Does every game need to be open world right now, or doesn't it? I personally, if I'm going to be a little bit controversial here, I think Rebirth is a lot more like Xenoblade Chronicles than it is Horizon. If we're just being honest, I love Xenoblade Chronicles, and I get the feels all over again when I'm playing Rebirth. But this is Xenoblade. I love it. I want more of it. I want to get back into Xenoblade, if I'm being honest. We got a podcast, Hero with 1,000 Potions podcast, season 1. We played Xenoblade Chronicles and I loved it. I need to get back into streaming Xenoblade Chronicles 2, right? But let's stop the hate just because one developer said they liked Horizon, right? Okay, moving on. Great. With that, thanks for stopping by. Thanks for checking out the video. Love ya. Check out other stuff by us. Check out anything you like and subscribe if you liked it, if you subscribe it. If you want to be a Gunblade guy, we have a Discord. If you don't, peace out. Love you. Have a good one. Play video games. They're good. Later.